US President Donald Trump dialed Prime Minister Modi last night and wished him on Diwali. Trump also said that during the call, the Prime Minister reportedly assured him that India will cut back on Russian oil. Now, this is not something new. India insists that the Prime Minister did not make any such commitment or even mention the fact that India will cut Russian oil in the call that happened between Trump and Modi. It's not the first time that Trump has been outright peddling this inaccuracy, this outright lie, but he keeps doing this, despite there being no evidence to show in terms of monthly import data that India has reduced its Russian oil purchase in any significant way. So the question is, why is he often repeating this lie? It's not the first time. Even when it came back to this whole India-Pakistan ceasefire, he ad nauseum repeated this lie that it was he and the United States that actually brought about the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. India has consistently maintained it was bilaterally arrived at. Also, these repeated lies, will it now throw a spanner in the works of this proposed meeting between Modi and Trump, which is supposed to happen at the end of this week in Malaysia on the sidelines of the upcoming ASEAN Summit? But first, I want to play out what Trump said at the Diwali celebrations at the White House. This was just moments after him and Modi had spoken on the phone. This is his version of events.
I spoke to Prime Minister Modi today, as I mentioned before, and we just have a very good relationship. And he's not going to buy much oil from Russia. He wants to see that war end as much as I do. He wants to see the war end with Russia, Ukraine. And as you know, they're not going to be buying too much oil. So they've cut it way back, and they're continuing to cut it way back.
Donald Trump has been claiming that he's spoken to the Prime Minister since last week, but the confirmation came from Prime Minister Modi today that the Diwali greetings were shared between the two of them. Trump once again reiterated that he's been assured by the Indian Prime Minister that Delhi will not buy any more Russian oil, or at least cut back on buying Russian oil drastically. In contrast, the Prime Minister's tweet nowhere mentions about Russian oil or cutting back on Russian oil. In fact, it says that both leaders exchanged their views on fighting terror unitedly, and the reference to terror is something that Trump did not make in his Oval Office comments, but the Prime Minister's tweet specifically talks about fighting and combating terror. Now, President Trump's claims on India cutting back on Russian oil imports are really not borne out by facts on the ground. Russia happens to be and continues to be India's top supplier of oil, and that has been the case over the last 3 years, despite all of these nudges and threats and, downright lies by Trump and his administration. Back in June of this year, Russia's share in India's oil imports were about 44%. At that time, India was importing close to 2 million barrels of Russian oil every day. That dipped a bit to 34% in July, around the time of the first set of tariffs going into effect. And it slowly came down to 37.8% in August. And the final month that we have full month figures for, Russia continues to be India's top supplier of oil, imported oil, at 34%. So it's come down to just about 1.5 million barrels per day. But that is in no way any substantial cutting down of Indian purchase or Indian import of Russian oil. There is simply no evidence to suggest on the ground that because of Trump's tariff threats or his repeated comments and fallacies that he's been sort of peddling that India will cut back on Russian oil, there's been any change to that effect on the ground. Let's listen into more reactions coming into this story, because this is something that has immediate consequence as well, because later this week, on Saturday and Sunday, is the ASEAN Summit in Malaysia. The Prime Minister and President Trump could possibly meet if both of them decide to travel to Malaysia. That is still up in the air. But could these repeated comments throw a spanner in the works of that proposed meeting?
पिछले 6 दिन में 4 बार वीडियो पर कहा है कि मेरी बात हुई नरेंद्र मोदी जी से। वो मेरे दोस्त हैं, अच्छे दोस्त हैं, और मैंने उनसे जो भारत तेल खरीद रहा है रूस से, उसके बारे में मैंने उनसे बात की, और मुझे आश्वासन दिया गया कि भारत रूस से तेल नहीं खरीदेगा। तो असलियत निकल गई है ना, तो बात हुई है। पहले कह रहे थे बात नहीं हुई है, बात नहीं हुई है, अब तो स्वीकार करना पड़ा कि बात हुई है। प्रधानमंत्री क्या छुपा रहे हैं, किस दबाव में है, क्यों इतने डरे हुए हैं? तो ये हाउडी मोदी नमस्ते ट्रंप पूरा बिगड़ गया है। बिल्कुल साफ हो गया है कि दोस्त दोस्त न रहा।
it comes down to the question of why is Donald Trump making such baseless claims? He's been repeating this, and of course the claims that he made about the ceasefire between India and Pakistan and mediation when Operation Sindoor were happening. He's been saying this again and again. Let's say, for example, what happened in May after the 4-day Operation Sindoor. Donald Trump was the first one to announce it to the world, and he claimed that he was the one who brokered the truce between India and Pakistan after Operation Sindoor. He's repeated that multiple times. I've lost count how many number of times he said that, more than 50 times in the last 5 months. But it is a fraudulent claim. It is a complete false claim, which India has rejected outright every single time he's made those claims. Trump is now claiming that India has promised him that they will end Russian oil imports. But again, the data, and I just read out the data a moment ago, it shows that is far from reality. India continues to import a hell of a lot of oil from Russia. In fact, Russia continues to be India's #1 supplier of imported crude. The MEA has also categorically said last week that no conversation happened between Trump and Modi. At least nothing happened last week. But there was a conversation that happened in the last 24 hours where Trump dialed Modi to wish him on Diwali. And again, there was simply no conversation about India cutting down on purchase of Russian oil. Donald Trump, of course, has proceeded to threaten India with more and more tariffs if Russian oil imports continue. In fact, India is the only country on whom an additional 25% secondary tariffs have been imposed because of what he calls the import of Russian oil. But India has made it clear that the purchase of Russian oil is done in India's national interest and to keep domestic prices low, and there is no changing from that position anytime soon. Now, all of this is coming in context of a possible meeting later this weekend between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. It could happen, it could not happen, we don't know. Neither side has officially declared that such a meeting has been penciled in. There is speculation that's rife over this possible meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. If they do meet on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit, then it will be the first time that they will be meeting since February, when the Prime Minister had gone to the White House. I think he was the third or fourth world leader to meet with President Trump right after he got re-elected for a second term. Would this now lay to rest all of these claims that Donald Trump has been making? And mind you, all of this is also coming as trade negotiators have been reaching what they believe is the final stages of hammering out an interim trade arrangement between Washington and Delhi. They say they're very much within reach of a trade arrangement or a trade agreement. It's only now up to both the principals to sign off. So will this meeting happen at all? Siddhant Mishra, my colleague, breaks it down for you.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Donald Trump could likely to meet on the sidelines of the ASEAN and East Asia summits later this week, with trade expected to dominate the agenda. The potential meeting comes amid renewed momentum in India-US trade negotiations as both sides work towards finalizing the first tranche of a bilateral trade agreement, BTA, by the end of November. Trump, speaking to reporters in Washington, confirmed he had spoken to Prime Minister Modi, saying the two leaders were working on a great deal with India. The US president has repeatedly hinted that New Delhi may gradually scale down Russian oil imports as part of the broader understanding being worked out between the two countries. Now, an Indian team of negotiators led by Commerce Secretary Rajesh Agarwal also concluded a visit to Washington last week, which was also aimed at accelerating the pace of talks and closing out pending issues with the United States as far as trade agreement is concerned.